On a Wednesday night, a glorious Wednesday in June. J.W. Colwell often lost like tears in the rain. Joined by Rich Drees, who recently passed his Void contest, which is good. You're not leaving any tortoises on their bellies, right? Like on their back.
Despite what some people may say about me behind my back, I do have emotional responses now and then.
You passed the blush response. Welcome to Generation Movies on a Wednesday night on the Loud and not the Indie Escape Network, I should say. I was going to say the Loud and Nerdy Network. That's crazy. That's getting ahead of ourselves. No, the Indie Escape Network. We're happy to be here. Happy you're joining us. It has been a good week for movies. It's been interesting. There's been controversy, all kinds of stuff going on. But
it's a good weekend coming up this too for movies.
It could be. Well, yeah, we don't talk about box office or anything, but it could be. We were just talking about it on another show. But basically, it could be the first weekend of the box office where we have several movies grossing 15 million or more at the box office. So theaters are kind of back, which is good.
Black Phone, Elvis, both opening this weekend. Both I've seen already, and I would recommend.
Hey.
Yes.
A little dive. Now, we're here to talk old school, though. We're here to talk 40th anniversary, and I've changed some stuff up. We still have the teeny weeny graphic there. That's nice. But we're talking Blade Runner. I've been playing around, and every once in a while, boom!
Wow, there it is.
But this poster has always caught me as one of the coolest posters for a movie. It's beautiful and stunning, and just it captures the movie in a nutshell. Femme fatale smoking a cigarette, spinner ships, Harrison Ford with a gun and a weird jacket. It all makes perfect sense. And this movie is one of the great sci-fi movies of all time. I'm gonna get that out of there because it's still pop, but we can.
Yeah, it definitely captures the noir feel of the film itself in an era when there's like two big heads on that poster, and it seems like a lot of movie posters now are just big heads.
There's a lot of stuff going on in the poster, though.
Yeah, there's a lot going on in that poster, and it's all creating a mood, or as the kids would say, a vibe. And
vibe.
And I love that poster. That is a fantastic poster. One of the few posters I like that I don't actually own a version of, which is weird for me.
When it's weird, the Blade Runner poster is an interesting poster because it's got a synthetic feel to it, but it also it perfectly captures. Like, I'll give you an example. There's a giant light burst around Harrison Ford's. Let's bring it back up. Hold on. There's a light burst around Harrison Ford's head in the poster. Okay. Now, you don't think anything of it, and then you see the movie, and there's nothing but light bursts, things coming in various places. It's the poster perfectly captures.
It's that Venetian blind idea too, which, when you look at it, there's a lot of Venetian blinds, a lot of that shadow being cast.
Yeah, it's a really cool poster. We have comments. Hold on, we have comments already, Rich.
Already? Oh my gosh.
What's up, JW Rich? Looking forward to another great show, gentlemen. Thank you, Brandon. He hosts a really cool show on our network as well. And then Joe Ridgely. Good evening, gentlemen. Great to see you. Great to
nice to see you, sir.
Great to text you as well. Thank you very much. Let's get right into it because we only have an hour, and frankly, you and I could probably talk for 6 hours about this movie.
Look, this movie is so amazingly dense that there have been actual full-length podcasts. Are you familiar with the minute, the movie by a minute podcast genre?
No.
They look at each successive minute of the film. So like the first episode is the opening credits at 0.00 to like 59 seconds, and then the second episode is minute 1 through 159.
That sounds amazing, but also like it sounds incredible. But for a movie like this, that's something that I feel like this movie is a movie you could really do that to.
Yeah, and I've guessed it on a couple of those, one on the Flash Gordon minute and the Escape from New York minute, and it's really made me appreciate the filmmaking on a really granular level when you start looking at things going, okay, I have to sit there with 2 other people and talk for an hour about, or 20 minutes, however long the episode is, about 59 seconds of cinema. Very structured, and this is definitely another movie that, yeah.
I feel like we pack a lot of punch in our hour though, so it's like we cover many years as the case may be when we're doing it. Production now, with almost all the movies we talked about in 1982, production on this starts in the 70s, right? It begins, almost always begins with some sort of concept about Star Wars, right? Star Wars. Oh, it always starts, and again, we're ending a day today where we finished a big Star Wars show, but Star Wars always begins with, they started talking about Blade Runner seriously in 77 when Star Wars hit, because they had all these properties just sitting around, right? Like they're all these books that can be adapted, all these things that can be moved around and done. But basically what happens with Blade Runner is the author is very, very careful about putting his book and allowing his name to be basically sold, right? Phillip K. Dick, and we're going to talk about him more as we hit legacy later on in the show. Also, stick around in the show, make some comments. More than happy to do some things for you. But the legacy portion of the show is where we're going to get into a big topic about Mr. Dick and his work, right? He starts with this publicated story called Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? He publishes it in 1968. And from the moment it hits in 1968, he has interest. People are interested. The interesting things you read, like Scorsese was involved at some point, where he looked at this thought-provoking sci-fi piece that he wrote, and basically, I love it. There are producers that option it in the early 70s. Main producer that options it is Herb Jaffe, right? But like I said, Philip K. Dick is very careful. He's a very careful author. He very much envisions a place where his book and the movie either work to promote each other or work to heighten the influence of the other, right? He looks at his movie and says, I want my book to be able to either, for a person watching the movie, to go back to the book and get more out of the book, or I want somebody who's reading the book to go to the movie and be able to get something out of that and tie them together. Herb Jaffe's son tries a shot at the screenplay. It doesn't go well, Rich.
This was a tough screenplay to pull together. And finally, when they first got it together, I'm hoping I'm remembering this in the right order. It was Hampton Fancher who kind of really pulled together the first workable drafts, and then they moved on to David Peoples to kind of give the polish to what ultimately Ridley Scott put in front of cameras.
Right, and the thing, you're absolutely right. And basically, Fancher, he comes in and he writes a screenplay, and Philip K. Dick is much happier with the Fancher version,
Mm-hmm.
and then eventually David Peoples comes in and basically punches it up to the level that Ridley Scott. Now Ridley Scott's toying around with a bunch of things after Alien. He toys around with a Dune, but that very slow production of Dune. He toys around with a couple other things, but he gets financing and he buys the title. So Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep is a great title. I don't
Mm-hmm.
I think that's one of the great sci-fi titles of all time. But Blade Runner has a hook, right? I don't know what it means. It's up to this day. I don't know that you can have a Blade Runner fan that can explain what Blade Runner means, but that's all Ridley Scott. Ridley Scott finds a bunch of movies that are basically novels. I think William S. Burroughs did a work with Alan Norse on a book called The Blade Runner, and they were doing an adaptation of a movie of that book, and Ridley Scott bought up the title. So we don't have a Blade Runner movie. We don't have a movie called Blade Runner without Ridley Scott realizing that it's a cool title that I don't think anybody understands. Right? Nobody who reads Philip K. Dick's work goes, Blade Runner. That makes sense. Right? Are they running with blades? What are they? But it's an interesting thing that it's a side project that gets picked up. They buy the rights to the project just so they can have the title. And
there's no in-world entomology that makes sense for this. Calling the cops who go out to retire replicants Blade Runners. Are there blades involved? Okay, some people are running. The replicants are on the run, but does that mean where does the word blade come in? Because it's never like a slang term used or anything. It's ridiculous, but it sounds so cool.
It sounds so fucking cool, Rich.
Yes.
But so they invest a ton of money. They eventually lose their financing though. But they get financing in a three-way deal with the Ladd Company. Alan Ladd, interesting cat, right? He's the guy that, again, I told you Star Wars is going to be involved a little bit. He's the guy that put Star Wars in production. Ladd Company is basically producing movies at this point, and they get money from them, and they get money from a Hong Kong-based producer, and Tandem Productions. They get $21.5 million for this movie. And you just you sit back and you go, okay, you got money for this movie. The author's happy, right? But he's not always happy. Dick is one of the more, how do you say this, Rich? He's one of the more mouthy authors. He's very opinionated about the trash that Hollywood is offering him, right? Mm-hmm. So he looks at one of the Fancher drafts and doesn't like it at all. He passes, says they're terrible.
I'm sorry. What was the budget again?
21.5 I have as financing from.
Okay, so that's about 60. That translates to roughly $63 to $64 million today. And if you've seen this movie, that's incredible that they were able to get that up on the screen.
Well, and that's yes, one of the things about this movie is production is there's not a bit of the movie where it doesn't look fully realized. And so not only do they have the author in place, they have the script in place, they land the director. One of the smartest things they do in this is Ridley Scott basically goes to futurists. He goes to a magazine, a French science fiction comic magazine called Metal Hurlant, right?
And they're known as Heavy Metal.
Heavy Metal. And finds a bunch of people that are involved with that magazine that he brings on as future stylists. And the idea of taking industrial landscapes and working them into making a working modern take on the future. One of the people is John Mobius Girard, who later, goes on to do all kinds of amazing work. But the one that comes really close and actually becomes responsible for almost all of the film's futurist stuff is Sid Mead. He's a concept artist, loves heavy metal. But basically he was working on something else, and he comes in and he just takes over, starts working production designer Lawrence Paul, art director David Snyder, and they start looking at sketches. And what I would say is, you have this behind you, Rich. You have this behind you, and it's in a wonderful box set that came out.
Yes, I do.
Yes, so do I. I think it's funny that like you and I both have it. But one of the things that comes in the set that's amazing, and I want to point out, a lot of cool things come in the set. The little spinner car comes in, a nice letter from Ridley Scott, but this amazing dossier here of future concepts. And what they do is they show you a picture of what the concept was, and then they show you on the other side what the vision was. So let me do that. And then this is the vision from the movie. And almost all these pictures in this dossier, Rich, are spot on. Like, they created, like, this car, like, Mead comes up with this car, and then this is the car in the film. It's an incredible, like, the void contest. You said you passed your test. And then this is the test in the film. You actually see it twice. So you have all the artists coming in, and they're not only are they doing production and killing it with the design, but they're also creating an entire world. Arguably the most created world. Like, I know we have Star Wars and we have all these movies where worlds are created, but the world building here is not only, it's something that's modern but decaying. It's something that's immediately recognizable but totally different.
And part of that's because, they're shooting in downtown LA. They're using places like the Bradbury Building, real world locations that have this 30s, 40s film noir, art deco, vintage feel, but also have that weight of, at that time, 40 years of use. So they're, a little crumbly around the edges, a little nicked, a little scuffed, a little used. And people are familiar with that kind of stylized look to begin with. And then just kind of adding a little bit of a science fiction veneer on top of that, it really helps actually sell the whole world built that, that they do there. All the world building that they do there, excuse me.
Yeah, and it's, so you have the world building there. You also have, they do a really interesting concept. They have a lot of live action stuff. They built sets, built things that moved up and down, did all kinds of things, like with the ships, the spinner ships, and everything. But also, one of the things the effects crew does is they work on this matte painting technique. And they work in this technique where they're using multi-pass exposures, where they're using, the way it's lit, the way it's shot, the way they rewind it, re-record it with different lighting to show like a movement in the piece. And a lot of it was some of it was using computers for the very first time, with the motion being controlled by computers. It is widely regarded as some of the best special effects ever put on film. And it's not necessarily for effects heavy stuff. You know what I mean?
So there's also some great model work in here too. And I was taking a look here. I don't think it's still on exhibit at there. But in 2019, I was at the Museum of the Moving Image in Queens, New York, and they had some of the Blade Runner models on exhibit there, including like one of the small spinner. They had a section of the Tyrell Corporation pyramid on display. and you could get up pretty close, before you hit that glass to take a look, and it was absolutely stunning, the detail and the craftsmanship and all of that stuff. And then once you see it, they photograph these giant miniatures, on these, tables that are like 10 feet by 10 feet. And then they just layer in a little bit of smoke as they're shooting, to give a kind of a haze and give it a depth. And it's phenomenal. Again, I was watching it earlier today, and just in awe of, how great that work is and how convincing that work is.
It still looks amazing. And
gosh.
one of the things, like one of the major decisions, and this seems to be like a trend for us. One of the major decisions that they come up with, this one is a real interesting music choice, right? It's not somebody getting a job. Vangelis comes on and he does the musical score for the movie. He had just won Academy Award for Chariots of Fire.
Mm-hmm.
He was, very much into using synthesizers, but every piece comes together. And what's interesting is that the score, like there are pieces and moments of the score that are they're very Japanese in nature. One of the cool things in the world building in this movie is that it's got cross generation, cross culture melding through it. Japanese, Chinese culture, as well as American culture, all kind of mixing together. They develop their own language for the movie. They come up with Vangelis coming in and basically doing like all this musical accompaniment that has, it's very much layered and very, from a kind of all different pieces from all over the world. There's a harpist. There's like all these things kind of come together. They do a tenor sax for the love theme, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like it's just this weird, like conflux of music, and the Vangelis choice is an amazing choice.
It's like futuristic blues in a way. You have that like very slow, like that sax stuff, which feels again very noirish, very sexy, especially like in the '80s neo-noir period, anyways. In like a lot of other films, like the DOA remake and things like that. But you have like this lush strings and these lush synthesizers underscoring all of that as well. It's
incredible.
On paper, I would almost say this wouldn't be a combination that would work, but somehow he makes it work, and it works really well.
Works. And so they go through the production. The things you pick up in the production during the casting, the casting choices were numerous, and and the casting choices for the Deckard character are all very like it's a who's who, right? Hampton Fancher, the screenwriter, envisions Robert Mitchum, and if you know anything about Robert Mitchum and Robert Mitchum movies, so most people know Cape Fear or
and he was already doing like some of those.
Wasn't he doing the Marlowe updates?
He was already doing the Marlowe updates in the late '70s to begin with, and so this is basically sticking Marlowe in the future, which it would have been amazing. I think
they Dustin Hoffman backed off. He was originally chosen, and that's a totally different movie. And basically, Ford gets it because of Star Wars and Raiders of the Lost Ark. But other people consider Gene Hackman, Sean Connery, Nicholson, Paul Newman. Paul Newman would have been very interesting. Clint Eastwood, Tommy Lee Jones, Schwarzenegger, Peter Falk, Nick Nolte, Al Pacino, Burt Reynolds, all part of casting for Deckard. They weren't sure of, but eventually Spielberg comes in and says, "Hey, he's not just the guy in Star Wars anymore. He's the guy in this." Mm-hmm. So he's in Raiders, and all of a sudden. And Ford is often talked about that he picked a movie that he really wanted to do that had more serious overtones. He was a little bit standoffish about doing kind of like the rugged adventure again. He wanted something with a lot going on, and this is part of it. One role that wasn't difficult to cast, however, was Rutger Hauer. He gets the role of Roy Batty. Who is the leader of the replicants, and it was all Ridley Scott went on a binge a bunch of Paul Verhoeven movies. They're all fantastic. Soldier of Orange, Turkish Delight, Katie Tipple, and
Speeches.
Batty. Yes, and actually, Howard had just come to the United States and done Nighthawks, so he was like he was right in the wheelhouse. And actually, he's one of the people that Phil K. Dick looked at and said he's, one of the things he said about them was he's the perfect baddie. He's cold, he's Aryan, he's flawless. And Hauer has called it his favorite movie. Rutger Hauer has called it his favorite movie, and he is perfectly cast. He also, and this is something you may not know about, you may not know that Hauer actually wrote the Tears in the Rain speech, and he gave it to Ridley Scott, and he said, I think my guy would say something like this, and he rewrote it, and lo and behold, it makes it into the movie and is widely regarded as one of the most humanistic portions of the movie. Like it's such a great monologue, and it's such a sad moment.
And you got to give credit to Ridley Scott there for recognizing that and being collaborative enough to allow him to be able to even come to him and say, hey, I have this idea for my final scene. Because some directors could look at it going, actors wanting to ham it up for their death scene. But Ridley Scott was like, no, this is great. This really encompasses, the idea of death. And, especially for someone who has seen a lot in the 4 years that they've been around.
And they actually look at one of the people who was also considered Morgan Paul. He played the role of, he's not in the movie very long. He plays the other, he plays Holden, the other Blade Runner that gets killed by Leon, portrayed by Brian James. He was originally thought they could play him for Decker, but eventually it goes to Ford. Then they fill out the cast. Edward James Olmos as Gaff. They fill out the cast with M. Emmett Walsh, a fantastically brilliant character actor from the 80s that everyone should go out and find. He's in a lot of movies. He's really good in them. They're all small bit parts. They're amazing. I plays Captain Brian. I was surprised. I watched the theatrical cut last night, and they dropped the N-bomb in the theatrical cut. I forgot about it.
Yep, same here. I was like, oh, good thing I don't have this cranked up too loud in my apartment building.
I totally forgot that Ford drops the N-bomb and talking about Bryant being a racist cop because he's very racist against replicants. They finish up the casting with a major cast. They finish up with Daryl Hannah as Pris, Joanna Cassidy as Zora. They also cast a relatively unknown actress named Sean Young as Rachel. She turns out fantastic. It turns out wonderful.
And you've got the great James Hong in here. You've got Joe Turkel. William Sanderson. William Sanderson, who everybody would know as Daryl.
Yes.
Or Larry from Newhart.
As J.F. Sebastian.
Yes.
I actually think J.F. Sebastian is one of the more amazing low-key characters in the film. And High Pike as the sleazy bar owner, Taffy Lewis, who, by the way, he has a moment with Harrison Ford where Harrison Ford's questioning him, and it's very much, Louis, the man is dry. It's a fantastic noir bar owner, decked in women, covered in jewelry, getting booze, trying to ply the detective with booze. Louis, the man is dry. One take for that. And Ridley Scott is one of the things in production that comes up is Ridley Scott is not a man who likes one take. Ridley Scott likes a lot of takes. And that the only real tension you hear about in the production, not a lot of fighting once production gets going and gets rolling. The only thing you do hear is that Ford and Ridley Scott, for a good long portion of their lives, did not get along, and they really did not get along in this movie. And Ford was used to not multiple takes, working with Spielberg, working with Lucas, You know what I mean? And just not having as much kind of take after take after take. And they almost came to blows. Let's see. Sean's jumping in with something. All those people, Harrison was the best pick in my opinion. Can't see any others playing a role. There are a couple, like when you read the list, like Nick Nolte.
Nolte would have been interesting. Mitchum, like we said, definitely
would have been really interesting, but it would have been older.
Mm-hmm.
Paul Newman, though. Paul Newman's right in his wheelhouse to play aging detective who may not like the smell of blood anymore. Like Newman, although Newman, I'm not going to lie to you, Newman can pull off anything. I rewatched The Color of Money. Jesus, it's so like all of his movies are so good. But they pick Ford. Ford is what would become the classic Rick Decker character. It becomes one of his iconic roles. We'll talk about that later with Legacy. But everything is designed. They make the spinner. They make the Voight Comp machine. They make all these special effects. And then the movie opens, Rich. The movie opens it opens in a bomb shelter, Rich. It opens in a bomb shelter.
Well, the post-production, there was some back and forth about the edit.
Oh, yeah. About that.
And yeah, there was some disagreement between Ridley Scott and the studios and the producers about exactly. Yeah. And he lost control. He didn't get.
I'm not going to talk about this in Legacy.
Because okay.
Of the amount of cuts. Well, no,
you know what? That's actually fair. That's fine. Yeah, let's hold off on that. We'll get more into all those different cuts and how we can all see them in just a few minutes.
They're everywhere. But I was thinking about it. Like in production, they sail through things. There's, Ridley Scott and Ford are at arms, and then also the only thing that comes up is there's a narration that eventually becomes what the studio wants and needs after a series of test screenings. I think that's where Rich was headed. But I put it in the Legacy portion because it becomes part of the history of the movie. The legend of the movie is how many cuts are there? Jesus. But
5. There's 5 available cuts.
There's a lot. And Sean writes, Paul Newman would have been so different but interesting. Paul Newman would have been interesting. Like everybody would have been interesting. It would have been different. But it opens at the box office. And 1982, Rich, we're going over 1982 on our show every week. 1982 is a minefield. There are hits everywhere in 1982.
Mm-hmm.
And there are movies that don't do as well in 1982. And Blade Runner is squarely in it does okay. Right?
Yeah.
It doesn't. There's so much competition at theaters in 1982 on January 25th when this movie opens that, Alan Ladd opens the movie on the 25th day of the month, which is a day he felt was lucky, right?
Mm-hmm.
He got lucky with Alien. He got lucky with Star Wars. But it opens. It has a decent opening weekend. 6.1 million is first weekend. But it's up against The Thing in its opening weekend, which takes away some of the money from the movie. Star Trek 2 is still going strong. Conan's still going strong. And E.T. is still going strong. And E.T. becomes the movie of the summer, becomes one of the biggest money-making hits of all time.
Yeah.
We will get to it at some point.
If this summer of 82 had not been so dense, I definitely Blade Runner would have had a better run at the box office. It's just, this is why we look back at the summer of 82 is because it was so amazingly packed with really
lightning in a bottle.
Really great. Yeah. It's one of those summers that you just obviously studio heads wish they had every year, but they only come along once every decade and a half.
So it cost about $21 million to make. It ends up grossing $41 million worldwide. Not great.
No.
But the one thing going for it is that out of the gate, the critical response is gangbusters. The response is astounding, really, when you look at it and you piece together different things. But the box office, doesn't translate, and also it's a competition thing. Sometimes at the box office, what you have is not necessarily a good movie that gets lost, but a movie that goes up against a bunch of other things that are just right now in the zeitgeist. Like, and I'm thinking about it. I think it's interesting. We talk about Blade Runner getting caught up in the churn of 1982 because, you know, it, and where it translates, an interesting translation point is this summer, right now. Lightyear is in a churn point, right? So it happens where you have a good movie that gets good reviews that people do want to see, but there's other things out that are taking up the oxygen. Maverick has taken up every bit of oxygen at the box office this summer in the most incredible display of I didn't see that coming ever.
It's closing in on $1 billion, as is Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness, which it's a Marvel movie. I don't think it's going to top out at $1 billion, but it's going to be close.
It's over 900 million, which is for a Marvel movie is disappointing. But for a movie like this, where it ties in for me. There's churn sometimes. Sometimes in these dense summers when you have all these movies that are all lined up, sometimes a movie loses its way and is found later, right?
Yeah.
And Blade Runner is definitely one of those movies. We got a question. Hold on.
Oh, okay. Question from the audience.
Sean says, now you have me thinking about how it would have been with Newman. I think Newman would have been fantastic, actually. Newman in the 80s, like if you go back and watch the 80s stuff, he knows who he is, and he's pinpointing material. You watch something like The Verdict, and then you watch Color of Money, and you watch Absence of Malice, and all these movies he puts together in the 80s that are absolute just star vehicles. But that's interesting. I'm glad Sean's thinking, because that's what we do on our show. Do you think Blade Runner was ahead of its time playing with other movies that had to compete against? Possibly 6 months to a year later, it would have been better. I think it would have done better. Like, I think it's clearly, like, I also think it would have done better at the Academy Awards and stuff. Like, I think it would have been in a prime spot to be the prestige movie it is.
If they'd held it to like a September or October release, yeah, definitely.
In New York and LA, and then the critical reviews and everything, the critical mass hits, and then it kind of festers out of control and becomes the. But here's the thing: part of Blade Runner's journey, though, and this is an interesting thing, Sean, right? Part of Blade Runner's journey is that it has to flop, not flop, but it has to struggle at the box office. Because if it doesn't struggle at the box office, and this is going to sound weird, but what I would say is with the box office receipts, right? If it doesn't struggle at the box office, people like you and me, Rich, when we find it and tell other people about it, wouldn't be quite as special. But I have a history with the movie, and I want to talk about that really quick. So I saw this original, like this movie. The reason it has a bigger place in my heart, I saw this movie at a New York Warner Brothers screening with my dad.
Oh, wow, nice.
It was in New York. It was a screening. Obviously I was the only 8-year-old at a screening for Blade Runner. But my dad, like, I was a big Harrison Ford fan. And my dad's like, oh, we'll go. And we went and we saw it in New York. And I came out of it going, this is amazing. And everybody, like all the adults in the room were like, who is this for? Right? And all these questions. And I'm like, look at my dad. And my dad's like, I don't know if it's going to do okay. But it's a great movie, right? We talked about it all the way home. Like, you can have great movies that aren't necessarily designed for box office attraction, right? And then, you know, it's just one of those movies. And wait, Joe writes, animated series totally ripped off this movie off in season 1, episode 39. It's had a Heart of Steel, even William Sanderson. Yeah, there is a. Thank you for bringing up Batman the Animated Series. It is one of a list of things we have to go over in Legacy. There are so many things that this movie has its cold replicant heart in. It's everywhere. But that's one of them. So box office doesn't go well. I'll point out, it doesn't do well at the box office, but again, an 80s film, it finds its place on home video, right? We look up, and part of the story with Blade Runner is the number of versions, right? We were talking about this earlier. The number of versions and the amount of play it gets on video cassette, on Laserdisc, on VHS and Beta. There are
Now,
many versions. There are many versions of the movie, Rich.
now thinking back as a kid, I remember, for like 2 or 3 months, it was the back cover advertisement on every comic book that you bought off the rack. And, Marvel even did a 2-part, miniseries adaptation of it. I
Yes,
think Al
beautiful.
Williamson did the beautiful artwork in that.
It's the
If memory
artwork.
serves.
The artwork is the iconic. One of the covers. I think I have it somewhere in my collection, somewhere hidden. But one of the pictures is the Marvel logo at the top, and Harrison Ford holding onto the building. It's beautiful. But so yeah, the comic book it hits in the comic book.
Yeah, it was Al Williamson who did that, and I think that all of that created that impression on people my age, preteens and 13, 14, 15-year-olds, that once the movie came out on VHS for rental, we were all like, oh yeah, that movie, I need to check that out.
Well, and then it the story gets going. There are versions of the movie. There's a version there's a test audience preview in Denver and Dallas. It gets negative responses. They eventually add they add the narration to the original theatrical print. Harrison Ford is dragged kicking and screaming to do the narration, mainly because Ridley Scott and Hampton Fancher and David Peoples aren't part of it. Right? They're not involved in the narration. It's basically just some Warner Brothers hacks kind of telling them what needs to be said so that they get the message conveyed to the audience. Although I got to tell you, when you watch it either way, either you watch it with it or with it, it comes across as a film noir, kind of like an interior monologue of a detective from like a Humphrey Bogart movie, right? But
theoretically, it does work.
Theoretically, it does work because it explains stuff that you might not get. Now, part of the problem with the narration is it goes away for long chunks of the movie, and then it comes back at inopportune times, like explaining Roy Batty's death, which is we're well aware of what's happening. But so there's an 82 version, there's a theatrical version which is 117 minutes. There's a domestic cut and international cut, which is a little bit more violent. It's also called the Criterion edition or the uncut version. There is a version because basically we couldn't handle violence in the United States at that point, I guess. I don't know. Just silly, really. And then there's a 1992, they release an anniversary edition, 10th anniversary edition, that becomes Ridley Scott's director's cut. And it's significantly different from the theatrical version. It removes the voiceover. It inserts the unicorn sequence. And it gets rid of a tacky ending with Stanley Kubrick footage from The Shining.
Yes.
Right? So the original theatrical version has the narration, doesn't have the unicorn sequence to give you the ambiguity about the Deckard character. And then it also has the really cheesy extra footage tacked on from Kubrick, The Shining, which had filmed for Warner Brothers.
Yeah, if you're a big Blade Runner fan, and you want to get like some really good analysis of like the difference between the theatrical 82 release and the 1992 director's cut, because we're getting another director's cut later.
2007.
And you can track, and you can track it down for a reasonable price. The now defunct magazine Video Watchdog did a really comprehensive look back in 92 when the director's cut came out that really broke down like everything, like even down by shot length, if something was like trimmed by a couple of seconds or whatever.
And if you can track this one down, what Rich and I both
or you could just, this version that we both have has
all of the
preview version, the domestic theatrical release, the international theatrical release, the 92 director's cut, and then the final 2007 cut. The final cut, which is again Ridley Scott doing even more jiggery pooing around with
Well,
this thing.
actually, the only time he's ever done any jiggering with it, because that was the one he was totally in charge of. The final cut.
Well, yes.
But that's where the box office takes a seat, and it finds its place. And then we do critical response. There's not a moment in the critical response of Blade Runner where it's not approved. Like, this isn't like The Thing that we talked about last week, where everybody hated it, and then eventually the love affair grew and grew and grew and grew. Blade Runner love affair with critics was from the get-go, right? There's not a moment where Blade Runner, it took a while for the masses to catch up to Blade Runner and achieve a cult status, but critics, right now in Rotten Tomatoes, it's an 89% approval rate based on over 126 reviews. It's an average of 8.5, which is pretty high. And also, if you look at something like Metacritic, the average score is 84, which gives you universal acclaim based on 15 critics, 84 out of 100. But there was a little bit of a mix, right?
But yeah, I was gonna say not all critics loved it though. I mean, Roger Ebert, excuse me, in his review, basically said, where was this now? He called it a stunningly interesting visual achievement, but a failure as a story. He just didn't get into the story at all here on this. He doesn't think it, did justice to Philip K. Dick's book, and that's where it all fell apart for him.
Yeah, a lot of filmmakers, one of the things that come up, like, it does get, the two things that come up the most are the script not being as tight as it could have been, and the pacing. It does have a leisurely pace to it. It clocks in about an hour 57 minutes. But Sheila Benson, one of the great Los Angeles Times critics, called it Blade Crawler. Oof. She was being funny, a little slow pace. And then Pauline Kael says it's a distinctive sci-fi vision, but it doesn't have any development with regards to humans and on human terms. So it's interesting that the critical response early is mixed, but also overwhelmingly positive. As it starts to break out, though, there's a review and books, and it's become the subject of dissertations. It's become, there are classes on it at universities, and it's become one of the defining. It's one of the most talked about movies. Like, you can never go to Blade Runner and not have somebody talking about it or figuring out where its place in society is. Look at that.
This is one of the best books on Blade Runner, and also just on, like, the process of getting a film made, because it really goes into, like, all the business stuff, and the drafts of the script and everything. And again, if you're a Blade Runner fan, you're looking for something really good to read on the
beach?
On the film.
Oh, I recommend it. The beach this summer. Yes. This would be a hell of a beach read.
Yeah. Oops.
We're always
all salmon. Future noir.
Yeah. That book is one of them. Also, there are other, people come out of the woodwork writing books, postmodern meta narratives, Blade Runner literature in the age of image. There's so many things. It becomes one of the most culturally, and eventually it gets full on praise from critics like Janet Maslin, that basically it totally changed cinematic and cultural discourse basically through its influence of films. Richard Corliss also basically has looked at it over 3 decades from a personal perspective, just being able to look at it and finding things. And that's where we jump into the amazing legacy. I think
I was going to say, I think here, though, where we're looking at Blade Runner as being influential, I think it's like one of the key foundations of what becomes the cyberpunk movement in terms of aesthetics, in terms of bringing an older literary tradition of of like noir, of detective fiction, of that kind of gritty examination of the underbelly of humanity to get, you know, a look at what makes us human in this case. You know, it's a crime story. A lot of cyberpunk are crime stories as well, and the the visual aesthetic also, informed so much. It revived the film noir look for a lot of projects, so we see that going forward in some films. We see it a lot in the just beginning movement of music videos. There are so many music videos around this time and for about 5 years afterwards that, absolutely ape and, should cut a check to Blade Runner for what they do. And even a TV show like Max Headroom, is absolutely and completely informed by Blade Runner in terms of its aesthetic and what it's trying to do.
Well,
in terms of, what makes a person a person.
The idea, like, I think the other lasting legacy, you look at Harrison Ford. Harrison Ford solidifies himself as not just the guy that can be in Star Wars and Indiana Jones. He comes. It's a very serious role. He's good in it. He would do it in other movies, but this is one of his best roles. You also look at the inspiration of filmmakers is so important, right? You look at somebody like Ronald D. Moore, David Eck. They create the Battlestar Galactica reboot that everybody falls in love with. But Blade Runner is one of the major influences for that show. The robots hiding in plain sight. You look at something like the cyberpunk movies, the anime Ghost in the Shell. You look at Band
as well, I would say.
Yeah. And all these, like, also video games. There's Shadowrun, which is making a comeback this summer on major game systems. You look at it hits across all these different businesses and even to a megalomaniac like Elon Musk, Tesla's Cybertruck is inspired by the film. It hits all these different pieces and filmmakers. One of the major filmmakers that it hits is Denis Villeneuve. Who goes on and with legacy franchise viability, I would say to you, at this moment, the Blade Runner franchise viability is very high because they're finding new and exciting places to do something. We just had Black Lotus, which was on Cartoon Network, which was an anime told from a female replicant perspective. We had Blade Runner 2049 a couple years ago, which I'm going to tell everybody, if you haven't seen it, easily one of the best sequels ever made.
Yes. I have a fun story about 2049. I remember going to the press screening for it about 4 or 5 days before it opened in Philadelphia at the Ritz East. And usually, it's a bunch of critics are there. We're all sitting there. Movie goes down. We watch it.
Oh, before you finish the story, Philadelphia critics, you do have an announcement, right?
Oh, well, yeah, I guess I could say this now. It's official.
Get it out there.
Okay.
You're hanging out with Philadelphia critics. You might as well.
I just recently have been inducted into the Philadelphia Film Critics Circle. Whew, that sounds fun to say out loud.
Yes. Nice. It's nice.
It's nice to have that
with somebody in the Philadelphia Critics Circle.
Oh, come on now. It's very nice to have that recognition from my peers. And I look forward to doing, whatever kind of things we're going to be doing to help advance film. And but
I'm sorry. I want to get it out there. I want you to yell it from the rooftop. I'm proud of my co-hosts.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I get humble or sometimes so anyways, so it's tough for me to self-promote.
You shouldn't.
But anyways, before the screening, the publicist comes to the front of the theater and says, "Okay, guys, I have a letter to read from Denis Villeneuve for you." And basically, it was a list of things they were asking us not to reveal in our reviews. And yes, there are certain things in the in the movie that you want the audience to be surprised by. You don't want to spoil too much. But the letter was literally saying, don't reveal the nature of this character. And they were asking us not to talk about things that were in like the first 3 minutes of the movie. And I'm like, okay, I can talk about the sets, the costuming, and the lighting of this movie. And that's about it, because I can't talk about the story at all. I can't talk really about a lot of the performances because that is dependent upon the story. It was a very weird situation to be in.
One, I think the most interesting thing about the sequel, right, is the idea that it. The funny thing about the sequel is that it's in very much the same position that the original is in. Like it didn't grow. It did okay worldwide, but it didn't do gangbusters, right? It did 92 domestic, 167 international, 259 worldwide. It cost a ton. It was $150 million movie to make. And so the funny thing about it is, I think it's one of those movies that will eventually get noticed, like its predecessor. Like it's going to be whatever. But the legacy is also the impact. You're right. The cyber noir, the idea, like, do we get the Matrix if Blade Runner isn't made? Do we get? And also, one of the things that this film champions, one of its biggest legacies, is the idea of a director's cut actually meaning something. Right. There are director's cut. There were many director's cuts in the 90s and 2000s, the aughts. And they did a lot of things. They did a lot of things where they were, pumping out these director's cuts with very minimalist change, very minimalist whatever. But the director's cuts of Blade Runner they're all profoundly different. Each one of the versions, like, I could easily watch all 5 versions of this movie and have different reactions to different scenes in each of them, and then get back to it. Like I said, I rewatched the theatrical for the first time in a while, because I'm usually watching the final cut. And rewatching the theatrical, the Harrison Ford narration, while pained, his pain sounds like a detective noir movie. It sounds like but the idea that you're having a legacy from it, that you basically have directors making their final cuts and making their director's cuts count.
Is all of Ridley Scott's director's cuts that have been out for his various films, I don't want to say, I want to say there are improvements on the theatrical cut. And I don't want that to sound like, the theatrical cut was garbage or anything like that, because even his theatrical cuts are great. But the like director's cut are like,
Kingdom of Heaven is one of those movies. And Alien's director's cut is weird, because it sets up something and it prepares you for something you're going to see later that you don't know what's going on. So it becomes, I would never recommend it to be shown. With regards to the cuts of Blade Runner, I know people sometimes some things coming in. Matt Frewer is so underrated. I agree. 2049 is so well composed. It's so detailed. It is. And then congratulations to you. Awesome for you.
Nice, thank you, guys.
And then congratulations, Rich. These are all worthy congratulations. There's no reason to shouldn't hide that shit under a rug. Again, I'm just good being next to you, so I'm cool. But the lasting legacy of this movie is one of the greatest legacies this movie has, right? Is the idea that, and again, it's like a movie we talked about last week with The Thing. There is a constant talking about this movie. You can have, if you have people that like The Thing or people that like Blade Runner, what happens is there is constant talk and a revisionist approach to every time you watch it, you see something new. Every time you watch it, something different. Like, I saw for the first time in a while, and it might just be because they've cleaned up the prints recently on digital and streaming, But there are dolls that are very similar to Pris in J.F. Sebastian's apartment, and him focusing in on that one, is a weird, like, he pulls the veil off. But there's another one that's over to the left that moves that I saw move for the first time. That completely freaked me out because it looks like it's an actress. You know what I mean? And like, there's little details. J.F. Sebastian is one of the most sad human characters in a sci-fi movie because he can't go off the road because he doesn't meet the health requirements. He can't beat his boss at chess. He's taken advantage of by the things he does like. And only has his toys. It's a very, it's a great movie. I can't talk about it enough.
One other thing I think that has helped contribute to the legacy of this film, at least up until the sequel, was the fact that it is ambiguous in the fact that is Decker a replicant or isn't he? And, that was very much open for interpretation. Even when Ridley Scott came out and says, well, I think this, but you're still welcome to think something else because, that's the way the movie is. It invites that question.
Between Scott and Hampton Fancher and David Peoples and Ford, too. Because Ford and Peoples have consistently maintained that I don't think he's a replicant. Right?
And I loved how there was kind of like that quantumness about is he or isn't he, and we're not going to actually say. And then, unfortunately, 2049 does give us a solid answer to that question and locks that in, and unfortunately takes away that little element. Usually, if I'll say, like, if I didn't like a sequel or something, I'll say, well, we still got the original. The original's great. This is one of those rare occasions where, yes, the sequel is great as well, but I think it does take something just a little bit away from the original in that it removes that ambiguity. It removes that ability for us to talk about the film in certain ways.
It away a little bit.
Which is a shame. I mean, but the Blade Runner has so much else going for it anyways, but and you can always choose to ignore the sequel if you want.
Can. Although I actually find it to be one of the best sequels ever made. Like, I think it's in my mind when I watched it, I was just like, this movie captures everything that the original set out to do. Final thoughts. Blade Runner again has been with me since I was a kid. I love it so much, and I find it's really funny. I find it is one of the few sci-fi movies that if you say some like Blade Runner to another sci-fi fan, or if you go to a movie and you witness something and you're like, oh, it's got a Blade Runner feel to it, right? And it's also in many ways similar. It's interesting the thing in the Blade Runner came out the same day, right? There are movies that have inspired, but also produced weaker, watered down versions of itself, right? And except when you get a filmmaker like Denny, who comes in and takes it and runs with it and does something totally different with it. But for the most part, like it's just watered down, and it's like getting like real Coke or like new Coke. You remember when they had the new Coke and they eventually had to go back to Coke Classic? It's like that. Like Blade Runner has so many movies that it's inspired and caused so much debate, and just I think it's one of the great movies of all time. And actually, it's one of the movies where I can judge you on whether or not you really love film, right? The Blade Runner is one of those movies. It is difficult to get through. It is dense material. It has a lot of stuff going on. It asks a lot of questions about God, our place in the universe, meeting your maker. It has all these things going on, swirling around it, and also has some really cool sci-fi elements, right? But it has so much going on. It requires your focus. And we don't have a lot of movies like that today.
And I would say, too, that if you're interested in the art of filmmaking, this is one of those foundational texts you really should be like digging into. You know, we have 5 different edits of the movie, and just watching, you know, the differences in those edits is going to teach you a lot about the craft of editing. It's, you know, its production history has been very well documented. And again, you know, with a book like, you know, Future Noir, or any of the other texts out there, critical looks at this movie, there's so much in there that so many people are going to be writing about it and bringing different ideas out. And that, you know, can only help you understand, you know, filmmaking more so than you would have before you started that deep dive.
And we haven't even touched we haven't even gotten into the philosophy stuff, the idea of slave labor, the idea of you know what people go through, what they see, and the monologue.
Creating a conscious, you know,
what
life form, but
yes.
putting a, you know, specific deadline on how long it's going to be able to exist.
Yeah, it's breathtaking.
It's a whole can of worms there of moral and philosophical ideas.
I don't know if anybody knows about this, and I am sure you do, but it's a tidbit. It's a for people who love the show and watch the show. I'm going to give you a brief knowledge check. So there's a Ridley Scott movie called Prometheus. It has a character, Wayland. Got to bring it up. It has a character that runs the Weyland-Yutani Corporation. He, at some point, also builds androids in the Sci-Fi universe. But I don't know if everybody knows this, Rich. Alien and Blade Runner take place in the same universe because the person who runs Tyrell Corporation knows the person that runs the Weyland-Yutani Corporation, and that is a documented factoid from Prometheus. Because one of the emails is about one of my friends that lost his life in LA because he did a whole genetics thing as opposed to just making proper androids. And so if you really do the deep dive, the connection of this movie is also connected to a movie called Soldier, which is written by David Peoples. So there's a through line to some of these sci-fi movies about these giant corporations that take control and take charge.
And play God.
And play God, yes.
And, you know, and it's great to see those thematic links through Ridley Scott's work.
Yes.
In certain, you know, and I think that's what makes his science fiction films a lot more interesting.
I never really viewed the Tyrell Corporation as evil as the Weyland-Yutani Corporation, just out of general principle. But when you think about it, Tyrell has built these genetic, you know, gods, and they only have 4 years to live. Yeah. And then he starts to decide to tamper with them and give them memories from people in his family. So he's as evil as the Weyland-Yutani Corporation. It's there.
At best, you could say he's passively amoral.
So,
but that's it.
Right. Yes. The corrupt movie. Yes. Direct tie. Same concept with the soldier being bred and designed for a particular purpose. There are connections in the Soldier movie.
And also in Soldier, there's a crashed spinner, and, you know, as part of a pile of garbage is somewhere. I remember that part of, you know, they're like going through some section, and there's like all this debris and stuff, and there is a spinner with crap on top of it. Yeah.
Do you know that they one of the sad things that happened was they had 2 or 3 spinners that they had on loan to Disney that eventually they were destroyed after the movie ride. The Great Movie Ride was shut down. Yeah, it's one of those things where it's like it was one of the saddest things I read in prep for the show tonight. But Blade Runner, if you haven't seen it, you should. If you haven't seen 2049, I'd also recommend that. And it's something to watch with a bunch of people and just have dinner and then a nice conversation about where we are, you know, making memories, what it means, whether or not you think Deckard's a replicant. Because he has one line in the movie that would lead me to believe that Ridley Scott was onto something. There's a line in the movie early on where he goes, "How does it not know what it is? Right? How does it not know that she's a replicant, and that would be. I think that's an ironic line if you don't know that you're a replicant. So
Exactly.
I always found that interesting. But
And
so
and I
I
think
mean,
it feels very of the moment too, when we had recent news story about somebody being let go from Google because he was fairly certain that an AI that they were developing was actually sentient. Whether it actually was or not, or if the guy was a goof,
yeah,
remains to be seen. But the idea that, at some point fairly soon, we as a species, are going to develop a technology that has its own sentience. And then we're really going to have to start thinking about how we define people, what being a person is, and there's a whole lot of legal questions involved there. And do these things have the right to their own personhood? It's gonna, and I can see religions getting involved with this. Oh, well, it doesn't have a soul because only a creator, a divine creator can instill a soul. And I think these are all ideas, though, that go right back to Blade Runner. And, are the replicants people? Do they, have the right for personhood? They seem to think so. But, do they have a soul or not? I would argue that Beatty's closing monologue at his death certainly argues that perhaps he has some kind of a version of a soul. So it's very prescient still 40 years later.
Yeah, 40 years later, it's ahead of its time, and it asks all the tough moral questions. If people say that it's boring or they can't get into it, I understand, but sit through it. It's worth a sit through. It also has and we're gonna end with this tonight. It has my single favorite. I want it on my tombstone, Rich. The light that burns twice as bright burns half as long. What is what Terrell says to Roy, and I think that is a perfect place to end. But before we end, Rich, where can people find your stuff? And we got a preview next week.
Okay. All of my writing's going to be at filmbuffonline.com. And the other podcast I host with my good friend Natasha Bogutsky is the Big Picture Podcast, and that can be found at bigpicturepod.com, or again, also through filmbuffonline.com.
So this week's...
And you can find me on Twitter at filmbuffrich.
So I'm on Twitter at at PA Movie Guy. I'm also on Facebook, Florida Movie Guy. We have Loud and Nerdy, which both the page, and we also have the group. The group is great. People come up with their own stuff, ask questions, the difficult questions like tonight when we had to do the top 5 cartoon aliens. So all kinds of good stuff going on there.
I'm sure Marvin the Martian was in there.
Question, Rich, do you like creepy trees and clowns?
Do I?
But next week is going to be perfect. Next week we're going to do Poltergeist. One of the big hits from 1982. Also one of the scariest films ever made. Also one of the scariest PG films ever made.
Oh my God!
So much to talk about. Join us next week. Before we go, though, I also do want to talk about this wonderful network we're on, Indie Escape Network. Incredible amount of talent going into it. You find the YouTube channel, Indie Escape Network. Tons of stuff going on. And Brandon Brooks has a great show coming up on Friday. He always has an interesting guest. The show's called IOU. Does interesting guests, talks about the film industry, talks about with the film industry. And it's always really cool. And he has whatever it is. And also you can find us also on Facebook. Facebook page, Indie Escape. Indie Escape Facebook page. We're going to be there for a while. We got Poltergeist next week. We're cruising through 1980, summer 82, one of the great summers ever. Also, if you're not enjoying the summer of pop culture, I don't know what you're doing, because it's a lot of good things going on out there. We'll talk again. Thank you for coming tonight. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Oh, a couple comments. Let's see. We got comments to end. Let's see.
Gonna blast through.
I got to blast through quick. I did Daryl Hannah Replicant. Yeah, I think so. I think everybody will.
Stand in line.
CJ, they're here. Yes, they are. And then Brandon, thank you so much. Great show, gentlemen. Look for next week. I love Poltergeist. One of my all-time faves. One of my faves too. And then we got two more. Oh my god, a bunch of comments coming in now. Night, great episode, brothers. Thank you, Sean. Joe says we've had Oliver Robbins from Poltergeist on before. That that kid, that clown, just terrifying. Peace, guys. Thank you. Peace to you too, Reed, CJ. Thank you so much. Have a great night.
Thank you again, ladies and gentlemen.
Watch a movie.